The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami was one of the worst natural disasters in history. It left Japan and its people utterly devastated and traumatized. Yet 4 months after this tragedy, the Japanese people were given a sense of hope again. A group of young women flew to Germany and achieved something no one thought possible. This is their story. The Japanese women's football team, nicknamed the Nadeshiko, defeated host China in the third-place playoff game of the 2010 Women's Asian Cup. This secured them the last spot given to Asian teams for the following year's World Cup. But it was a spot that they almost decided to give up, however. After the earthquake and tsunami disaster, the team came very close to withdrawing from the competition. Japan's National Football Training Center, J-Village, was based in Fukushima, the site of the nuclear disaster caused by the 2011 earthquake. It was therefore used as a place of refuge immediately after the disaster, and then subsequently a base for nuclear recovery. The grassy pitches were now lined with steel plates and became a parking spot for heavy machinery. Factors such as this, alongside the personal trauma suffered by some of the players, meant the team was zoned out and more focused on helping their country's recovery efforts. This included defender Aya Samashima, who worked for the company that ran the nuclear plant at Fukushima. But a collective decision was made to compete, to bring some joy, or at least distraction, to the rest of the country. But there was little expectation for the Nadeshiko. They had won just 3 of their last 16 games in Women's World Cup matches. And whilst the women's game in Japan had been developing, it was still miles away from the growing professionalisation of football in the USA and much of Europe. Yet Japan went in with no fear and nothing to lose. They had, after all, seen their countrymen lose so much over the previous few months. It was this attitude that resulted in an opening game win against New Zealand, followed by thrashing of Mexico. A final group game defeat to England saw Japan reach the quarter-finals. This itself was seen as a heroic achievement, given the team's failure to reach the knockout phase at the previous tournament in 2007. Yet they now faced the host team, Germany, with an average height of over 6 foot, whereas the Japanese were the team with the smallest average height and known for their technical skills rather than their physicality. Yet they began to show a more fiery side. They picked up 4 yellow cards in that game, which was almost unheard of from the Japanese, with some joking that that's usually what Japan gets across 2 entire World Cups. And it was this dogged performance that allowed them to take the Germans to extra time before Karina Maruyama scored the winner. And it was revealed after the game that coach Norio Sasaki showed his team footage of the disaster that had befallen their homeland during his pre-match team talk. It was his way of reminding his players that they had not only come so far, but they still had so far to go if they really tapped into what they were playing for. Because Japan was still in mourning. Hundreds of thousands of people back home were still displaced. Families had now lost faith of ever finding loved ones who had gone missing. And the recovery efforts were exhausting for those leading them, with thousands continuing to work night and day to build communities from the ground up. So to reach the semi-final led Japan to finally believing they had a chance of going all the way. And in the semi-final, they swept past one of the favourites, Sweden, 3-1 after coming from behind. Back home, a collective sense of excitement and anticipation gripped the Japanese people. Many had loosely followed the team's journey thus far, but now that they were in the final, the whole nation were uniting over a possible miracle. So the Japanese people went to bed early the night before to wake up for the final that started at 3:45 AM local time. But the Japanese were facing the United States, the tournament favourites, who were just beginning a period of dominance that would see them win the next 2 World Cups. A golden generation of full-time professionals were emerging, including Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan. And the media also sure to constantly remind fans that the Japanese had never beaten the US, with a record of 3 draws and 22 defeats. Many felt the Japanese's story of inspiration would fail to capture its happy ending. And to begin with, it seemed that way. The US missed a flurry of chances in the first half and arguably should have been a few goals up. Japan were quite simply lucky to go into the break 0-0. But it seemed that luck ran out when, with 20 minutes to go, substitute Alex Morgan fired the United States into the lead. It was now a question of sheer will. Could the Japanese fight back? And for a country plagued by misfortune only a few months prior, they were then granted a slice of luck after a defensive mishap by the Americans allowed Ayamiyama to poke home for Japan and send the tie into another round of extra time. The Japanese looked near legless as the 11 outfield players were stretched out by their substitute teammates to fight off cramp at the end of 90 minutes. And this pain in their legs grew stronger as the fantastic Morgan caused havoc for the Japanese during extra time, and just before the end of the first half, crossed for Abby Wambach to restore the US's lead. It was now a case of throwing every last ounce of whatever they had left. And with just 3 minutes to go in extra time, Japan won a corner. Running towards the front post, captain Homesawa thrust a leg out to hook the ball brilliantly into the net. It was at this point glimmers of hopelessness appeared on the faces of the Americans. Some unimaginable force kept the Japanese alive no matter what. As the tie went to penalties, the Americans looked nervous and the Japanese for the first time seemed calm. And it was defender Saki Kumagai who coolly hammered in her penalty into the top corner to complete one of the most remarkable sporting achievements in recent memory. The Japanese became the first ever Asian champions of any World Cup final, and back home kicked off wild celebrations into the early morning and following afternoon. After the pain and unrelenting suffering that the nation had undergone just 4 months prior, Japan now had something to give them hope and the belief that things would get better. And as the ceremony came to a close, an iconic image was played through the screens of millions. The many hands on top of each other holding up this trophy that now resembled an entire nation's beacon of hope.